the Galactic Council declared war. Humanity responded with something they never anticipated. The message arrived not as a broadcast, not as a weapon, but as something far more deliberate. A narrowband transmission aimed directly at Earth's deep space relay network at Lagrange Point 2. Someone somewhere had known exactly where to aim it. That alone should have been the first warning. The date was March 14, 2189. At the time, Earth's Unified Space Administration had been tracking 17 distinct anomalies in the outer solar system for 6 weeks. Gravitational distortions that didn't match any known natural phenomenon. The Cassini array flagged them as potential macrostructures operating under some form of coordinated spatial compression. Scientists were still arguing about what that meant when the signal came in. It was not a greeting. The translation, assembled over 72 hours by a joint team of xenolinguists, AI semantic engines, and applied mathematicians working in shifts out of the ESA's orbital facility, was precise, deliberate, and almost elegant in its coldness. You have expanded beyond your designated threshold. You have been observed, catalogued, and evaluated. The hegemonic council of the Oran Compact has reached consensus. Your species poses a long-term systemic risk to regional stability. You are hereby ordered to cease all extrasolar operations, dismantle your deep field relay infrastructure, and submit to biometric registration within 30 of your planetary rotations. Non-compliance will result in corrective action. There was no preamble. No introduction. No name attached. Just the assumption that whoever was sending the message had already decided what humanity was, and that their opinion was final. The United Earth Council convened an emergency session within 4 hours of the completed translation. Secretary General Amara Osei read the message twice, set it down, and looked at the assembled representatives of 11 billion people. They didn't ask, she said quietly. They informed. That distinction mattered. It mattered enormously. In the days that followed, the global reaction was not panic, not the wholesale collapse of social order that science fiction had spent 2 centuries predicting. There were protests. There was fear. There were religious movements that interpreted the contact as confirmation of their cosmologies, and there were online forums that declared the entire thing a government fabrication, and there were 3 separate stock market circuit breakers triggered in 48 hours. But the dominant mood after the initial shock was something harder to name. A kind of stillness. The sort of stillness that happens when an organism suddenly understands that a larger predator is aware of its existence. Not paralysis. Recalibration. Admiral Chen Wei, then commander of Earth's combined fleet, a force of approximately 340 combat-capable vessels, a mix of patrol frigates, missile platforms, and the 6 capital ships that formed Battlegroup Helios, received his briefing package at 0300 station time aboard the ESS Endurance, in high orbit over Mars. He read the message. He read the intelligence annex attached to it, which contained everything the Cassini array and the outer system probes had been able to gather on the 17 anomalies, now confirmed as ships. Alien warships. Each one registering gravitational displacement equivalent to a structure somewhere between 2 and 4 kilometers in length. 17 ships. Each one the size of a small city. Chen Wei had spent 31 years in military service. He'd fought pirates in the asteroid belt, suppressed 2 separatist engagements in the Jovian moons, and participated in the first deep field mapping missions beyond the heliopause. He was not a man given to hyperbole. He read the message a second time. Then he opened a channel to Joint Command. Tell me everything we know about how they fight, he said. Not what they have. How they fight. That question, unremarkable at first glance, would become the axis around which everything else turned. Because humanity's response to the Oran Compact ultimatum was not going to be a show of force. It was not going to be a surrender. And it was not going to be the frantic scramble of a species caught flat-foot by a threat it hadn't imagined. It was going to be something far more dangerous than any of those options. It was going to be careful. The 30-day window the Compact had given was not, in military terms, an act of mercy. It was a test. An observation period. 17 warships sitting at the boundary of the solar system, watching everything humanity did, every signal, every ship movement, every orbital adjustment, and feeding that data back to whatever command structure existed beyond them. The Compact expected one of 2 responses. Capitulation or aggression. Both would be useful to them. Capitulation confirmed their assessment of human threat potential. Aggression gave them legal and political justification, within whatever framework governed their coalition, to escalate. What they did not appear to have accounted for, and this is the part that would later be analyzed in every serious study of the conflict, was a third response. Deliberate, structured ambiguity. Within 72 hours of the translation being confirmed, humanity's combined fleet began a series of maneuvers that looked, on passive sensors, like defensive repositioning. Ships moved toward Earth, toward Mars, toward the major population centers. On the surface, it appeared exactly like what a frightened species would do, pulling its forces inward, protecting its core. But Admiral Chen Wei hadn't ordered a defensive formation. He had ordered a documentation exercise. Every vessel in the fleet had been tasked with one specific objective during those repositioning maneuvers: collect as much observational data as possible on the 17 compact ships without triggering any behavior that could be classified as aggressive. Distance, emission signatures, reaction times when human ships changed vector, communication patterns between the 17 vessels, the way their gravitational displacement fields shifted when they adjusted orientation. 17 ships, 30 days. 340 human vessels moving, deliberately, in ways designed to generate observable responses. Humanity was running an experiment. And the Oran Compact, watching what they believed was a frightened species retreating to defend its core worlds, had no idea they were the subjects of it. In Geneva, in the deep archive facility beneath the ESA's administrative campus, a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka was working on a problem that nobody had asked her to solve yet. She was a xenostrategist, one of 4 in the world who held that specific designation, a field so new it barely had institutional recognition. Her job, in the simplest terms, was to think like something that wasn't human. She had been given the translation, the sensor data, and one standing directive: identify every assumption embedded in the Compact's ultimatum. She filled 40 pages in the first 12 hours. The assumption that 30 days was a meaningful deadline to a species with Earth's level of organizational infrastructure. The assumption that humanity's deep field relay network was offensive infrastructure rather than exploratory. The assumption that corrective action would be understood as a deterrent rather than as information. The assumption that humanity would respond the way the Compact's models predicted, the way every other species they had encountered had apparently responded. That last one she underlined 3 times. They have a model, she wrote. They've done this before. Which means they have expectations. And expectations are vulnerabilities. She set down her pen and stared at the page for a long time. Then she wrote one more line. Find out what they've never seen before. And do that. On day 6 of the 30-day window, the ESS Meridian, a midweight survey vessel reassigned to Battle Group Helios for the duration of the crisis, performed a navigational correction that the compact sensor arrays almost certainly logged as routine. It wasn't. The correction placed the Meridian at a precise orbital position relative to the largest of the 17 compact ships, the one the fleet had designated Bogey 1, a structure approximately 3.8 kilometers long that held what appeared to be a command or coordination function based on the volume of tight beam traffic it exchanged with the other 16 vessels. The Meridian was not armed. It carried no weapons beyond the standard point defense array required by fleet safety protocols. But it carried something more useful: a modified long-range spectrographic array and a passive gravitational resonance detector that the ship's science team had spent 4 days recalibrating specifically for this task. For 6 hours, the Meridian orbited in what looked, from any external vantage point, like a completely unremarkable solar survey pattern. For 6 hours it listened. What the spectrographic array detected changed the course of the entire strategic response. The compact ships were not running on anything analogous to a human power architecture. The gravitational displacement signatures that had initially been categorized as propulsion turned out to be something far more complex. A continuous oscillation pattern that suggested the ships were actively manipulating local spacetime geometry not just to move but to perceive. Their sensor systems appeared to operate on the same principle as their engines. Which meant, with reasonable probability, that they were blind to anything that didn't register as a significant gravitational event. A single human frigate, on passive systems moving slowly and predictably, would read to them as background noise. Admiral Chen Wei received the Meridian's report at 0600 on day 7 and sat with it for 3 hours before calling in his senior staff. When they assembled in the Endurance's briefing room, he had only one thing to say. We're not going to meet them where they expect us to be. The plan that emerged from the next 48 hours of planning would later be called Operation Understory, a name chosen deliberately for what it implied. Not the canopy. Not the visible layer. The thing growing underneath, in the dark, that the larger organism couldn't see until it had already spread everywhere. The concept was straightforward in principle and staggeringly complex in execution. Humanity's 340 combat vessels would not form a defensive perimeter. They would not mass into an engagement formation. They would not, under any circumstances, perform any maneuver that would read as preparation for a conventional military confrontation. Instead, over the next 22 days they would disperse. Not randomly. With exquisite precision. Every ship assigned a specific position within the solar system based on a model that Dr. Tanaka's team had developed. A three-dimensional map of gravitational shadow zones, regions where the geometry of the solar system's mass distribution would make a human vessel essentially invisible to the compact sensor architecture unless one of their ships moved to within approximately 40,000 kilometers. 340 vessels, each one slipping quietly into a pre-calculated position, running on minimal power, waiting. The compact's 17 ships would be watching a solar system that appeared, from their vantage point, to have a shrinking human military presence. Ships moving inward. Fleet consolidating. A species appearing to comply. What they would actually be watching was an empty stage. The performance was for them. But Operation Understory was only half the response. The other half was happening in Geneva, in Tokyo, in the shipyards of Ceres and the industrial platforms of the Jovian L4 cluster, and in 300 laboratories and manufacturing facilities that had been operating under emergency protocol since day 2 of the crisis. Humanity had 30 days. The compact, in issuing that deadline, had apparently assumed that 30 days was not enough time for a mid-tier technological civilization to meaningfully alter the strategic balance. They had not accounted for what happens when you give an industrial civilization that has been running at peacetime capacity a single, unambiguous reason to stop doing that. The Ceres shipyards alone had, in the previous 40 years, produced an average of 12 new vessels per year. It was a respectable number. It reflected normal resource allocation, normal workforce deployment, normal peacetime priorities. In the first 7 days of the crisis, the shipyard administration submitted an emergency production proposal to Joint Command. It called for the immediate conversion of all civilian construction capacity to military production, the activation of 16 mothballed fabrication platforms, and a workforce expansion drawing on the reserve labor pool maintained under the Unified Defense Protocols. Joint Command approved the proposal in 4 hours. The shipyards were not going to produce 12 new vessels. Not in 30 days. The physics of manufacturing didn't accommodate that kind of acceleration, and no honest officer was going to pretend otherwise. But they could produce components. Prefabricated modules. Weapon systems that could be attached to existing civilian vessels. Point defense arrays. Sensor packages. Electronic warfare suites. They could, in 30 days, take a fleet of 340 dedicated warships and expand the effective combat capability of that fleet by repurposing several hundred additional vessels that the compact's analysts had presumably catalogued as non-military assets. A cargo hauler with a reinforced hull, a military-grade sensor array, and 2 missile batteries is not a frigate. It does not perform like a frigate. It does not survive like a frigate. But it shows up on a sensor screen. And if there are enough of them in the right positions, they change the mathematics of an engagement in ways that matter enormously. Dr. Tanaka presented her full strategic assessment to the United Earth Council on day 9. She spoke for 2 hours and she did not use a single slide or visual aid, because the argument she was making was one she needed the council to hear, not see. The core of it was this. The Oran Compact had come to the edge of the solar system expecting to find a species that would respond the way all the other species they'd encountered had responded, with predictable, patterned behavior driven by fear, ego, or political calculation. They were not wrong that fear and political calculation were present. They were wrong about what those forces produced in humans under pressure. Every culture that has existed on Earth, Tanaka said, has at some point faced an existential threat from a larger, better-equipped adversary. In the historical record, the species never fought the war the larger adversary expected. Never. Not once. They found oblique angles. They used information asymmetry. They prolonged conflicts beyond the point where the cost-benefit calculation flipped for the aggressor. She paused. The Compact has more firepower than we do. They almost certainly have more ships than we do beyond what we can currently see. They may have technological advantages we haven't identified yet. None of that changes the fundamental problem they have created for themselves by issuing a deadline. She looked around the room. They told us exactly when the rules change. Which means we know exactly how long we have to make the rules irrelevant. On day 14, Bogey 3 moved. It was the first significant maneuver any of the 17 compact vessels had made since taking up their positions at the heliopause. The ship, a vessel roughly 2.4 kilometers in length, categorized by fleet analysts as a midweight combatant based on its emission profile, broke from the outer formation and moved inward along the ecliptic plane at a velocity suggesting deliberate, measured advance rather than attack. It stopped at the orbit of Neptune. Every analyst, every command officer, every strategic planner watching from the Endurance came to the same immediate conclusion. Bogey 3 was a probe. The compact was testing response time. They wanted to see how fast humanity would react to a ship moving deeper into the solar system. Admiral Chen Wei issued no response order. Nothing moved. No human vessel changed position, changed power output, or broke communications silence. The solar system, from Bogey 3's perspective, continued to look like a species quietly and reluctantly complying with an ultimatum. Bogey 3 sat at Neptune's orbital distance for 18 hours, transmitting steadily back to the main formation. Then it returned to its original position. Whatever it had reported, it had apparently been satisfied with what it saw. On the Endurance, Commander Daria Okonkwo, Chen Wei's chief intelligence officer, updated her behavioral model of the compact formation. She had been building it since day one, treating the 17 ships as a single organizational organism and mapping every observable decision they made against a matrix of possible strategic frameworks. The picture that was emerging was not what she had expected. "They're cautious," she told Chen Wei that evening. "More cautious than I'd expect from a force this size with this kind of capability advantage. They're not moving aggressively. They're watching and confirming before they do anything. Is that good or bad for us?" Okonkwo considered the question carefully. "It means their decision cycle is slower than their firepower would suggest. They have more capacity than they're willing to use without authorization or confirmation from whatever command structure is behind them. There's a chain of command here with significant friction in it." Chen Wei nodded slowly. "So they can't act faster than their command loop." "Which is slower than ours," Okonkwo confirmed. "We're a unified command with delegated authority. They appear to be a coalition, which means consensus before action." That observation went directly into Dr. Tanaka's strategic model in Geneva. She had already suspected something similar: the deliberate, formulaic quality of the ultimatum, the 30-day window, the use of specified conditions. All of it pointed to a bureaucratic structure. Something that operated through established procedure rather than adaptive improvisation. A coalition that needed consensus to act was a coalition that could be made to wait. And waiting, in the current situation, worked entirely in humanity's favor. The question of what to say, whether to say anything, had been debated in the United Earth Council since day one. There were factions that argued for immediate communication, dialogue, an attempt to negotiate or at least to understand the compact's position more fully. There were factions that argued for silence as a form of defiance. There were factions that wanted to transmit a formal protest under whatever framework of interstellar law might or might not exist. Secretary General Osei had held the line on all of it for 2 weeks. No communication. Not yet. Her reasoning, supported by Tanaka's analysis, was precise. Any communication humanity sent before day 30 would be processed by the compact as information about humanity's internal state. And right now, humanity's internal state was one of intense, organized, and very deliberately concealed preparation. Sending any message risked revealing elements of that: the urgency of the response, the nature of the decisions being made, the existence of a coherent strategic plan. Silence, paradoxically, was more threatening than negotiation. Silence suggested confidence. Silence suggested that whatever was happening inside the solar system was happening on humanity's schedule, not the compact's. On day 16, that theory received its first meaningful test. A second message arrived from the compact formation. It was shorter than the first and in its brevity, somewhat more revealing. "Your compliance window has reached its midpoint. No acknowledgement of these terms has been received. Any further delay in response will be interpreted as intent to resist. Clarify your status." They wanted an answer. The silence was bothering them. Osei read the message twice, then handed it to Tanaka. Tanaka read it and smiled, not with triumph, but with the particular satisfaction of a hypothesis being confirmed by data. "They expected us to break by now," she said. "Either comply or push back. The silence is outside their model. What do we tell them?" Tanaka thought for a moment. "Something true. Something that gives them no useful information whatsoever." The response humanity transmitted on day 17 was 7 sentences long. It confirmed receipt of the original ultimatum. It stated that the matter was under formal consideration by the appropriate governing bodies. It noted that 30 days was a compressed timeline for a civilization-scale decision of this magnitude. It expressed no hostility. It made no threats. It requested no concessions. It was, in diplomatic terms, the most carefully engineered non-answer in the history of human communication. And it worked, not because it deceived anyone, but because it was accurate in every particular while revealing nothing about the actual state of humanity's preparations. The compact received it, presumably processed it through whatever bureaucratic apparatus existed in the formation's command structure, and went quiet. Meanwhile, in the gravitational shadow of Jupiter's mass, something unprecedented was taking shape. Battlegroup Understory, a name not yet in any official record, was not a fleet in the conventional sense. It had no flagship, no centralized command vessel, no formation that would read as military on passive sensors. It was 211 vessels of varying size, type, and capability, distributed across a volume of space roughly 15 million kilometers in diameter, each one maintaining strict emissions discipline and communicating only through pre-scheduled, low-power burst transmissions on frequencies the Meridian's analysis suggested were below the sensitivity threshold of the compact's gravitational sensor arrays. Cargo haulers running with their drive signatures throttled to minimum. Survey vessels with military sensor packages grafted to their hulls. 8 dedicated warships, each one moved to its position over 12 days of incremental, unhurried repositioning that looked, from the outside, like routine traffic management. And at the geometric center of the entire dispersal pattern, positioned with extraordinary care by a team of 3 navigators working independently and checking each other's calculations, the ESS Tanaka, a vessel that had not existed 10 days ago, assembled from prefabricated modules in the series shipyard and given its name by Admiral Chen Wei, without ceremony, while standing in a fabrication bay listening to the sound of welders. The Tanaka carried no weapons. It carried the most sophisticated electronic warfare suite humanity had ever built, assembled under emergency protocol from technology that had previously existed only in laboratory environments. Its primary function was signal architecture, the ability to generate, shape, and project electromagnetic signatures across a broad spectrum. In other words, it could make things appear to be where they weren't, and make things disappear that were very much still there. It was not, in any technical sense, a weapon. It was something more fundamental than a weapon. It was a way of controlling what the enemy believed was real. On day 23, Dr. Yuki Tanaka requested a private briefing with Admiral Chen Wei. She traveled to the Endurance in a courier shuttle, a 4-hour trip she spent reviewing files she had already memorized, because reviewing them again was the only thing keeping the anxiety manageable. She was not afraid of the compact. Not exactly. She was afraid of being wrong about the compact. There is a particular kind of professional terror that belongs to strategists and analysts, the terror of a model that feels correct until the moment reality demonstrates that it wasn't. She had built the strategic architecture for humanity's entire response on a set of behavioral assumptions derived from a total of 17 observable ships, 2 messages, and 1 6-hour passive sensor scan performed by a survey vessel that technically wasn't supposed to be where it was. If any of her core assumptions were wrong, the consequences would be measured in lives and possibly in civilizations. Chen Wei met her in his office, a room that showed its years, covered in physical maps and printed reports in a way that contrasted sharply with everything digital around it. He listened to her for 20 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You think they're going to push the timeline," he said. It was not a question. "The second message told us something important," Tanaka said. "They expected a response by now. The silence is generating pressure inside their command structure. Something is pushing them toward early action, and it's not military logic. It's political logic. Someone in that coalition needs to demonstrate momentum. Which means day 30 might not be day 30. Correct. We may have between 3 and 7 days less than the original window." Chinwei absorbed that. "What changes?" "Nothing in the operational plan. We're ready for early engagement." She paused. "What changes is the diplomatic layer. If they move before day 30, we gain something significant. They violate their own stated terms. Which matters," Tanaka said carefully, "not to us. We're beyond caring about their procedural justifications. But it matters to whoever else is watching. The compact is a coalition. Coalitions have internal politics. If they act early, out of process, there will be members of that coalition who have concerns about that." Chen Wei looked at her steadily. "You're thinking about the long game." "I'm always thinking about the long game. Winning a single engagement with 17 ships and having the rest of the compact arrive in force 3 months later is not a victory. It's a delay." She leaned forward slightly. "The only outcome that matters is one that changes the compact's calculus about what engaging humanity costs. That means we need witnesses. We need this to be visible to the right people. She placed a data chip on his desk. The Meridian detected 17 ships at the heliopause. Its burst spectrum analysis also detected 11 additional signatures. Smaller, much fainter, positioned at approximately twice the distance of the main formation. They are not warships. Their emission profiles are consistent with observation platforms or diplomatic vessels. Chinwei picked up the chip. Someone's watching the watchers. Someone inside the compact's own political structure wanted an independent record of this engagement. Which tells us the compact is not monolithic. There are factions. And some of those factions are uncomfortable with what the hegemonic council is doing here. She stood. When this engagement happens, and it will happen, I need us to fight it in a way that those 11 observation platforms can accurately report. Not just that we resisted, but how we resisted. And what we chose not to do. On day 25, Chinwei issued the final operational orders for Understory. The language was deliberately plain. No heroic phrasing. No invocations of history or civilization. Just clean, precise directive language that said exactly what each vessel was supposed to do, in what sequence, under what conditions. The fleet's 340 primary vessels remained in their visible defensive positions closer to Earth and Mars. Battlegroup Understory remained dispersed and silent in the outer solar system. The Tanaka came online at minimum power, running its electronic warfare systems through a final diagnostic sequence. And in Geneva, Secretary-General Osei prepared a third message to the compact, one that would not be transmitted unless the compact moved early, one that had been drafted not to plead or threaten, but to state, with complete clarity and in language that any observing diplomatic vessel would understand perfectly. You are acting outside the framework of your own stated terms. This action is noted and recorded. Humanity's response is being conducted within the scope of defense of sovereign territory as recognized by the same interstellar conventions you have invoked in issuing this ultimatum. We hold you to the same standard. It was 29 words that claimed, without aggression, the moral and procedural high ground. It was also a direct communication to the 11 observation platforms at twice the heliopause distance. The compact had given humanity 30 days. Humanity had used 25 of them to construct a response that the compact's war council, political structure, and internal opposition could not simultaneously dismiss. On day 26, Bogey 1 changed its emission profile. The gravitational displacement signature shifted. The oscillation pattern the Meridian had identified modulated into something that Okonkwo's team had never seen before. That's a new configuration, she told Chinwei, her voice careful and controlled. Power up. Something like it. Different though. It's not consistent with what we'd expect from a weapons charge. She paused, studying the data. It's a signal configuration. A coordination array. They're networking the 17 ships into a unified structure. Chinwei was quiet for 5 seconds. They're not going to wait for day 30, he said. No, Okonkwo confirmed. They're not. Chinwei opened the fleet-wide channel. Understory, this is Fleet Command. Execute Phase 1. Maintain emissions discipline. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Position and hold. 211 vessels, scattered across 15 million kilometers of darkness, began to move. Slowly. Quietly. Like water filling a shape it had been poured into long ago. The trap was set. The question now was whether the compact would step into it the way Tanaka had modeled or whether, despite everything, the strategist had gotten something critically wrong. She was aboard the Endurance when the alert came in. The 17 ships were moving. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and got to work. They came in formation. That was the first data point that mattered, and Okonkwo registered it immediately. A wedge structure, the 17 ships moving in a configuration that projected force concentration at the leading edge while maintaining reserve capacity at the flanks. It was not a scout formation. It was not a probing maneuver. It was an advance intended to close distance, present overwhelming capability and compel a response. In other words, they expected humanity's forces to consolidate and meet them. They were heading directly for Earth. Admiral Chinwei watched the tactical display in silence as the compact formation crossed Neptune's orbit at a velocity that put them roughly 9 hours from Earth engagement range. Around him, the Endurance's Combat Information Center operated with quiet efficiency. Voices low, movements precise, no wasted motion. Visible fleet posture? He asked. Commander Okonkwo checked her board. Battlegroup Helios is maintaining defensive orbit around Earth. Battlegroups Ares and Minerva holding at Mars Sun L4 and L5. Everything looks exactly like a species bracing for an assault on its home world. Good. Chin-Wei turned to the communication station. Transmit the OSE message. The 29 words went out immediately, not toward the compact formation but broad spectrum in all directions, ensuring the 11 observation platforms at twice the heliopause distance received it with absolute clarity. A notification to the record. A statement of legal and procedural position. A signal to anyone watching that humanity knew the rules of the game even if the compact had decided to discard them. Then Chin-Wei turned back to the tactical display. Tanaka begin Phase 1 emissions. What the Tanaka did in the simplest terms was lie. Not with words. With physics. The electronic warfare suite came to full power and began generating a series of carefully constructed electromagnetic and gravitational signatures, false emissions profiles, synthetic drive signatures, the energetic fingerprints of vessels that did not exist. From the compact formation sensor perspective, the space between Mars and Earth suddenly became considerably more crowded. Not with an army. Not with an overwhelming display of force. The Tanaka's output had been calibrated precisely by Tanaka's team to avoid triggering any automated threat response that might accelerate the compact's engagement timeline. Instead, the false signatures suggested something more unsettling than firepower. They suggested that humanity's actual force distribution was unknown. Vessels where there shouldn't be vessels. Signatures that didn't match the defensive formation the compact had been watching for 26 days. An interior of the solar system that suddenly refused to be read clearly. In the compact formation something changed. The wedge structure shifted. The leading elements decelerated. The tight beam communication traffic between the 17 ships, which Okonkwo's team was monitoring passively and logging with the Tanaka's enhanced sensor array, spiked dramatically. They're conferring, Okonkwo reported. High-volume intership traffic. Formation has reduced approach velocity by approximately 40%. Chin-Wei said nothing. He was watching a clock on the secondary display, the elapsed time since the Tanaka had activated. Every minute the compact spent conferring and adjusting was a minute that worked in humanity's favor. Dr. Tanaka, standing at the back of the CIC, watched the same clock. Her model had predicted a 15 to 30-minute hesitation. A force that operated through consensus and had built its strategic plan around a predicted human response would need time to process the discrepancy between prediction and observation. The Tanaka's false signatures had introduced enough ambiguity to force that processing pause. At minute 17 the compact formation changed course. Not retreat. Not full stop. A lateral deviation. A sweep that took the formation's leading elements off the direct Earth approach vector and moved them toward a wider arc. They were attempting to get a better sensor angle. Trying to resolve the ambiguity that Tanaka had introduced, which moved them directly into the geometry that Operation Understory had been built around for 11 days. Phase 2, Chin-Wei said. In the outer solar system, Battlegroup Understory's 211 vessels powered up simultaneously, not to combat power, not to anything that would read as an attack charge. Just enough to become visible on the compact's sensors. For the first time since day 1, the compact could see what had been hiding in the dark. 211 vessels. Scattered, asymmetric, not in any formation a conventional military mind would recognize. Positioned at angles that covered every obvious retreat or advance vector. Already inside the distances that mattered. Not surrounding the compact formation, not with those numbers against 17 ships of that size. But present, in a way that fundamentally changed the tactical geometry of every option available to the compact's commanders. The intership communication traffic in the compact formation didn't spike this time. It stopped. What happened in the following 40 minutes was not a battle, in the conventional sense. It was a negotiation conducted in the language of position and implication. The compact formation held its new vector for 11 minutes, during which Okonkwo's team noted that the Unified Coordination Array, the networking configuration Bogey 1 had powered up before the advance, shifted into a different mode. Less broadcast, more receive. The 17 ships were consuming information rather than exchanging commands. They were looking at what they were actually facing and updating their assessment. Tanaka had predicted this. A coalition force operating through consensus, encountering a situation that violated its operational model, would pause before escalating. The political cost of a miscalculation, of committing to an engagement that went unexpectedly, was too high for any single commander to absorb without broader authorization. But Tanaka had also predicted something else, and she watched for it with the particular alertness of someone who has staked everything on a single inference. At minute 28, Bogey 7 separated from the formation. Not toward Earth. Not toward any of the Understory vessels. Bogey 7 moved toward the 11 observation platforms at twice the heliopause distance. "They're reporting in," Tanaka said quietly. Chinwei looked at her. "To their political structure," she continued. "Bogey 7 is a courier or a liaison vessel. The hegemonic council's field commanders just hit a situation they weren't authorized to handle unilaterally. They're asking for guidance." That meant two things. First, the engagement was paused for as long as that consultation took. Second, and more importantly, the consultation itself was being conducted within sight of the independent observers who had watched the entire proceeding. Whatever the Compact's field commanders were about to report to their political leadership, it was being reported in a context that included a record of the OSE message, a record of the early advance, and a record of what humanity's actual response had looked like. Chinwei allowed himself a single long breath. "Stand down phase 2 emissions to holding posture," he said. "Do not move any vessel. Do not power down any vessel. Hold position and wait." He turned to the communication station. "Get Secretary General OSE on the line. Tell her we need her standing by for a second transmission." He looked at Tanaka. "What do we say next?" She had already written it. The second OSE message was 43 words. It had been drafted by Tanaka over 6 hours, revised 11 times, reviewed by 3 linguists and 2 strategic communication specialists, and ultimately reduced from 400 words to 43 through a process of elimination that felt, to everyone involved, like surgery. Every word that was not absolutely necessary was removed. Every phrase that could be read as a threat was removed. Every element that suggested desperation, anger, or fear was removed. What remained was this: humanity has not initiated hostilities. Humanity has not violated any stated condition of the original ultimatum. Humanity's forces are in position to defend sovereign territory, which is our right under the same interstellar conventions you cited. We are prepared to discuss terms. We are also prepared to continue waiting. The choice of next action belongs to you." It was transmitted broadly with the same spectrum characteristics as the first message, ensuring the observation platforms received it cleanly. And then humanity went quiet again. Bogey 7 spent 4 hours and 17 minutes at the observation platform cluster before returning to the main formation. Whatever conversation had happened out there, whatever the field commanders had transmitted to their political leadership, and whatever the political leadership had transmitted back, the outcome was visible within minutes of Bogey 7's return. The compact formation changed configuration. The wedge structure dissolved. The 17 ships dispersed into a looser arrangement, not scattered, not defensive, but not the tight attack formation they had maintained since crossing Neptune's orbit. The gravitational coordination array on Bogey 1 powered down from its networking configuration. Okonkwo stared at her board for a long moment. "They're standing down from combat posture," she said, with the careful flatness of someone who doesn't trust a positive development enough to celebrate it yet. "Confident. 90%. The formation shift is consistent with stand-down protocols in every documented military structure we have. They're not retreating, but they're not attacking either." She paused. "They're waiting." Chinwei nodded once. "Then we wait too." The waiting lasted 9 hours. During those 9 hours, every human vessel held its position. The Tanaka maintained its holdings posture. Enough power to remain visible, not enough to read as a threat escalation. Battlegroup Helios stayed in its defensive Earth orbit. The 211 vessels of Understory floated in the dark, present and patient. In Geneva, Secretary General OSE sat in her office and did not sleep. In the ESA Deep Archive facility, Dr. Tanaka reviewed her model for the 47th time, looking for the thing she had missed, the assumption that was about to invalidate everything. Aboard the Endurance, Admiral Chinwei ate a meal he didn't taste and drank coffee he didn't need and read a book he couldn't concentrate on, because the alternative was staring at a display that wasn't going to show him anything new until the compact decided what it was going to do. The third message from the compact arrived at hour 9:22. It was different from the first two. The first two had been transmissions, signals aimed at humanity as an object to be addressed, a problem to be managed. The tone had been the tone of administration, of procedure applied to a lower category of entity. The third message addressed humanity as a party. The Hegemonic Council acknowledges receipt of your communications. The Council notes that the engagement protocols followed by our field forces require review in light of observed conditions. A formal cessation of advance is ordered pending Council deliberation. You are requested to maintain current force disposition and avoid any action that could be interpreted as offensive intent. The Council will communicate further within 2 of your planetary rotations. Tanaka read it 3 times. She identified 7 things in those words that the first 2 messages had not contained, and every single one of them mattered. The acknowledgement of her messages, by name, by implication, confirmed that her communications had reached the political level of the compact, not just the field command. The reference to review of engagement protocols was an admission, however oblique, that something had not gone according to plan. The phrase, observed conditions, was particularly significant. It suggested that the compact's political leadership had received a report that diverged meaningfully from the strategic model they'd been operating on. But most important was the last sentence. The Council will communicate further. Not the field commanders. Not the coordination array aboard Bogey 1. The Council itself. They're escalating our status, Tanaka said, when she'd assembled her thoughts enough to brief Chinwei. We were a management problem handled at the military level. We're now a political problem being reviewed at the leadership level. Is that good? It means we got through. The observation platform report got through. Whatever those 11 independent observers saw and transmitted to the Council, our strategic posture, the OSE messages, the fact that we didn't fire first, it was enough to create friction inside the coalition. She set down her notes. Someone in the compact's political structure looked at this engagement and saw a liability, not a victory. Chinwei was quiet for a moment. We haven't won anything yet. No, Tanaka agreed. We've won the right to a conversation that wasn't on the table 8 days ago. That's not nothing. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough, and both of them knew it. The next 2 days would determine whether the conversation led somewhere real, or whether the compact simply used the pause to reposition for a different kind of pressure. Humanity had surprised them once. The question was whether surprise was enough, or whether what came next required something more. On the second day of the pause, Tanaka made a recommendation that the Council debated for 6 hours before approving. She proposed that humanity take a specific, visible, and entirely voluntary action, one that would cost nothing militarily and everything symbolically. She proposed that humanity pull back. Not retreat. Not comply with the original ultimatum. Not dismantle anything or register anyone. Just move 3 of Battle Group Helios's forward frigates to positions 40,000 kilometers further from the compact formation than they currently occupied. 40,000 kilometers. Less than a third of the Moon's distance from Earth. Militarily meaningless. But visible. Measurable. A gesture that said, we are not seeking escalation. We are choosing restraint. We are doing this because we choose to, not because you forced us. The Council debated whether it was weakness. Tanaka's argument was that it was the opposite. Strength is easy to demonstrate, she said. What's harder to demonstrate, and what the compact's political structure needs to see, is control. Discipline. The capacity to choose not to act even when acting is possible. The frigates moved. The compact formation registered the movement. The coordination array on Bogey 1 pulsed once. A query to the observation platforms presumably, or a communication to the Council. 4 hours later, the Council's response came. Not a message. An action. Bogey 12, which had been the closest of the 17 ships to the boundary of Mars's gravitational influence, moved back. Approximately the same distance the frigates had moved. The mathematics of de-escalation. The careful, reciprocal geometry of 2 parties who had been on the edge of a catastrophic exchange, feeling their way back from it. Chinwei stood at the display and watched Bogey 12's new position stabilize. Well, he said to no one in particular. The formal talks began on what would have been day 34, 4 days past the original ultimatum deadline. They were conducted through a communications relay established by mutual agreement at the midpoint between the compact formation and Earth, a neutral coordinate in space that both parties had proposed independently, a coincidence that Tanaka considered the most encouraging sign of the entire proceeding. The compact's delegation was led by a representative identified in the transmission as First Consul Vetharun of the Oran Compact's Council Secretariat. Humanity's delegation was Secretary General Osei, backed by a team of 12 that included Tanaka, 3 xenolinguists, 2 military officers as technical advisors, and 4 specialists in interstellar law, a field that had existed in theoretical form for 60 years and was now, suddenly, urgent. The first session lasted 11 hours. It was not, by any measure, a negotiation. It was closer to a mutual inventory, both parties establishing, through careful and often exhausting exchanges, what the other party actually was and what the other party actually wanted. The compact, it emerged, was not a monolithic empire. It was an alliance of 31 species operating under a treaty framework that had evolved over approximately 400 years. The treaty included provisions for what it called threshold management, the process of evaluating and categorizing newly spacefaring species to determine whether they posed risks to established members. Humanity had been evaluated. The assessment had concluded that human expansion patterns, communication behaviors, and technological trajectory placed Earth's civilization in a high uncertainty category, not inevitably hostile, but statistically likely to become a destabilizing force in the region if left unmanaged. The ultimatum had been the compact's standard threshold management protocol. Osei listened to this explanation with the patience of someone who has learned to absorb information before responding to it. Then she asked, with genuine curiosity, how many species had been subjected to the threshold management protocol. The answer was 23. Osei asked how many of those 23 had responded the way humanity had. There was a pause in the transmission, a processing delay or a consultation or possibly both, before First Consul Vetharoon's response arrived. None. That single data point reshaped everything that followed. The compact's threshold management protocol had been applied 23 times. In every prior case, the species in question had either complied with the ultimatum, attempted to fight conventionally and been deterred by the display of force, or attempted to flee, to abandon whatever extrasolar installations they had established and retreat to their home system. Not one had responded with silence, careful preparation, and a strategic posture that made the engagement's outcome genuinely uncertain. Not one had transmitted a legal and procedural challenge that was recorded by independent observers within the compact's own structure. Not one had, in the middle of what was supposed to be an overwhelming show of force, offered to de-escalate voluntarily and in a measurable way. What Tanaka had understood from the beginning, and what the compact's leadership was only now grappling with, was that the threshold management protocol had been designed for species at a specific stage of development, capable enough to build interstellar infrastructure, not capable enough to resist being managed. Humanity was at that stage technologically. But humanity was not, in any meaningful sense, at that stage strategically. 400 years of documented human history included more large-scale political conflicts, coalition wars, asymmetric engagements, deterrence frameworks, arms control negotiations, proxy conflicts, and intelligence operations than the compact had apparently encountered across all 23 previous threshold management cases combined. Humanity had been learning how power worked between unequal parties for millennia. The compact had spent 4 centuries building a system that worked because no one had ever pushed back against it intelligently. The talks produced, over 6 sessions spanning 8 days, a preliminary framework that neither side called a treaty. The word was politically loaded in both directions, but that both sides agreed constituted a binding set of mutual commitments. Humanity would submit to a documentation process, not the biometric registration of the original ultimatum, but a structured exchange of information that both parties had input into designing. The compact would receive verified data on Earth's population, civilization extent, and development trajectory. Humanity would receive, in exchange, verified data on the compact's membership, governance structure, and territorial boundaries. Humanity's deep field relay network would remain operational, but humanity agreed to notify the compact before establishing any new infrastructure within a defined region of space. A region smaller than the compact had originally demanded, negotiated down over 3 sessions by an argument Tanaka had prepared 16 days earlier. The compact's 17 ships would withdraw from the solar system. In exchange, humanity agreed not to increase the military capacity of its outer system installations beyond current levels for a defined period. Both parties agreed to the establishment of a permanent communication channel, staffed continuously, with defined protocols for dispute escalation. And the 11 observation platforms remained where they were, by mutual consent, newly formalized as the monitoring infrastructure of an independent verification body that had not existed before day one and would be expanded within the compact's existing treaty framework. They had, in the end, created an institution. That was perhaps the strangest outcome and the most durable one. Dr. Yuki Tanaka returned to Earth on a transport that took 11 days, because she had specifically requested a vessel that was not in any hurry. She needed the time. She spent most of it writing, not the formal reports that were expected of her, not the strategic postmortem that Joint Command would require, but something more personal. A document she never published and never shared with anyone for many years, which she titled simply Notes on What We Didn't Do. The core of it was this: humanity had not won a war. It had prevented one. The distinction, she wrote, was everything. Wars leave wreckage, physical, political, psychological wreckage that shapes everything that comes after. The prevention of a war leaves a different kind of mark, the mark of a choice made under extreme pressure, correctly. The compact had come expecting to manage a threshold species. What it had encountered instead was a civilization that had made, under 30 days of existential pressure, consistently intelligent decisions. Not perfect decisions. Not easy decisions. Decisions that required restraint at moments when action would have been emotionally satisfying and strategically catastrophic. Humanity had not been lucky. Luck would have run out. What humanity had been was prepared, not with the weapons and ships that would have made a conventional confrontation possible, but with the institutional knowledge, the strategic culture, and the individual people who knew how to apply that knowledge under conditions that would have broken less experienced civilizations. That was the story that needed to be told, Tanaka wrote. Not the story of a species that won a war it shouldn't have. The story of a species that recognized what kind of fight it was actually in and fought that fight instead. Admiral Chinwei retired 14 months after the talks concluded, in a ceremony that was notable for how short it was. He said 3 things publicly. He thanked the crew of the Endurance. He thanked Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who understood the shape of the problem before anyone else did. And he said one thing that became, in the years that followed, the most quoted sentence of the entire proceeding. We didn't impress them with what we could destroy. We impressed them with what we chose not to. The Oran Compact, in the decade that followed, admitted 2 new member species under a revised threshold management protocol. One that included, for the first time, a provision for species that did not respond to the standard framework. The provision was informally known within the Compact's administrative structure as the Human Clause. It specified that any species demonstrating strategic coherence, institutional restraint, and the capacity to engage diplomatically under duress was to be evaluated under an entirely different framework, one that treated contact as a potential partnership rather than a management problem. Humanity was not the last species to encounter the Compact's threshold protocols, but it was the first species to change them. That, in the end, was the real answer to the ultimatum. Not defiance. Not surrender. Something harder than both and more permanent than either. A precedent.